Did Joseph Smith fight polygamy? The resurrection of an old RLDS narrative by Kimberly Smith. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about what I consider a very sacred topic. I want those who listen to this video to know that I am very aware that the idea of Joseph Smith's polygamy and early practice of plural marriage in our history is a source of controversy. In fact, plural marriage has been a source of controversy since the beginning of its practice by early members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. However, it is imperative that we understand that those who practice plural marriage understood and knew that the Lord revealed the doctrine to the prophet Joseph Smith, and also that the Lord commanded the practice to be instituted among select church members. In today's world, the prophet Joseph Smith and the early saints who practice plural marriage are under attack. Our history is under attack, and the traditional narrative surrounding Joseph Smith's polygamy is being reinterpreted by those with a very dark agenda. No man, perhaps Joseph Smith excepted, who has belonged to the church in this generation, ever possessed the gift of prophecy to a greater degree than Apostle Heber C. Kimball. In 1856, he warned future generations of the church when he said, quote, "I want to say to you, my brethren, the time is coming when we will be mixed up in these now peaceful valleys to the extent that it will be difficult to tell the face of a saint from the face of an enemy to the people of God. Then, brethren, look out for the great sieve. For there will be a great sifting time, and many will fall. For I say unto you, there is a test is coming, and who will be able to stand?" He continued, "To meet the difficulties that are coming, it will be necessary for you to have a knowledge of the truth of this work for yourselves. The difficulties will be of such character that the man or woman who does not possess this personal knowledge or witness will fall. The time will come when no man nor woman will be able to endure on borrowed light. Each will have to be guided by the light within himself. If you do not have it, you will not stand." Close quote. Even though we are not called upon to practice plural marriage today, I believe the time has come for every faithful member of the church to gain his or her own witness and testimony that the prophet Joseph Smith did receive a revelation from God which commanded plural marriage. Ultimately, the only way to know truth from error is through revelation. That doesn't mean we rely upon our own thoughts and feelings. There is only one source. The only foundation that is so firm it will never fail is God and His Word. To receive revelation requires significant sacrifice and time and energy. Living pure and being able to pray and receive answers is critical so that the Lord can help us to see things the way that He sees them. It is essential that we study the history in context, prayerfully, and being guided by the Spirit to find the truth, that we henceforth be no more children tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the sleight of men and cunning craftiness whereby they lie in wait to deceive. Right now we have two very prominent and persuasive narratives in the church surrounding Joseph Smith's polygamy. However, they are two very different and very conflicting narratives, which leads to what I call a trap of false dilemmas. The first narrative is the progressive narrative. Decades of progressivism have challenged the traditional foundations of the Restoration. On one hand, we hear allegations that Joseph Smith was guilty of hidden sins. Some say he was an adulterer, a womanizer, even a pedophile. On the other hand, we are seeing the resurrection of a revisionist movement based on a century-old claim that Joseph Smith never practiced plural marriage. Some of those behind this dark narrative are actually claiming that the death of the prophet Joseph Smith was plotted by Brigham Young. The existence of this conspiracy sits upon a theory based on conjecture, speculation, opinion, belief, proposition, argument, which I might add is unproven, unprovable, unrealistic, and unhistorical. In the age of controversy and conflicting narratives and opinions, thousands of members find themselves unintentionally seduced by the voices on both sides. But we have to ask ourselves, if either of these narratives are true, where are we at? Where is the restoration? There is one thing that both of these narratives have in common. Both narratives either silence the voices of the women completely, or they hijack the women's own stories and offer a destructive interpretation of the facts. Why? Because the testimonies and first-hand witnesses of the women of the Restoration have the ability to shatter both narratives. Helen Mar Kimball was the daughter of Apostle Heber C. Kimball and a plural wife of the prophet Joseph Smith. She felt that she had a sacred duty to defend the practice of plural marriage, to publish her defense of the practice to the world, and to record her history for future generations. She wrote, quote, "Should we not write our history to be handed down to our children and to all future generations, that they may know the true history of those who endured all things which their enemies saw fit to place upon them for the sake of establishing this work upon the earth?" Close quote. Helen Mar Kimball published 2 important pamphlets to the world. One is called Why We Practice Plural Marriage, and the other, What Joseph Smith Taught About Plural Marriage. A lesser-known woman of the Restoration, also named Helen, also felt called upon to stand in defense of plural marriage and to bear her witness to the world and to future generations. She wrote, quote, "To raise my voice in public has ever been a source of much embarrassment to my sensitive nature. Indeed, I always feel my inability to address even my sisters in this capacity. But duty and justice demand that my voice should now be heard, and would that my words of faith in defense of my religion might re-echo and find accordance in the heart of every true-hearted woman. I know the principle of plural marriage to be a truth. I have lived in polygamy for the last 33 years and was among the first to enter that sacred principle." Closed quote. In the testimonies these women left behind, we can find the truth. This has been given to us as a gift, the words of those who had the foresight to record their testimonies for future generations. Within our history lies a great heritage of wisdom and knowledge. The majority of their words, like many truths, have been distorted, misrepresented, and even buried under concerns of today, are being hidden from our view or destroyed by men and women in an effort to change the real history of these people. And I say enough. The women of the Restoration are the nursing queens spoken of in the Book of Mormon. From the day they, in the name and the fear of the Lord, their God, undertook to build Zion, they have been persecuted for righteousness' sake, a people scattered from the beginning. The record of their lives is now set unto you, that you may have the opportunity to judge them in the spirit of righteousness. So shall you be judged by him who they have honored, whose glory they have sought, and whose name they have magnified. Despite many claims to the contrary, many of the testimonies of the women are recorded in private journals never meant for public consumption. There is no logical hypothesis yet to explain this. The odds of pulling off a conspiracy with that many people involved, spread over continents, that length of time in private documents never meant for the public eye, and with a consistent historical timeline and narrative is impossible. Perhaps that is why those who refuse to believe that Joseph Smith entered into eternal marriage covenants with his plural wives hide and even revert your attention away from the women's private documents. We share the sacred trust of our forefathers and foremothers, who gave us the responsibility to seek out the valuable truths in our history. We should not be blinded by those who profess to be exposing the facts, and who would seek to destroy the foundation that so many have sacrificed so much to build. We should reject the words of those who attempt to sever our family ties, who want to bury a once sacred truth, and who endeavor to take away a heritage that is rightfully ours. However, those who seek to discredit the women's testimonies often accuse them of lying for the Lord and refer to a single statement alleged to have come from Phoebe Woodruff that actually comes from a false or unreliable source. They wave this false testimony as a victory banner to discredit all of the women's testimonies. I give credit to Brian Hells for settling this issue.
The video reportedly quotes Phoebe Woodruff in 1882, who was asked by a friend, "How is it, Sister Woodruff, that you have changed your view so suddenly about polygamy? I thought you hated and loathed the institution." Reportedly, Phoebe responded, "I have not changed. I loathe the unclean thing with all the strength of my nature. But, sister, I have suffered all that a woman can endure. I am old and helpless, and would rather stand up anywhere and say anything commanded of me than to be turned out of my home in my old age, which I should be most assuredly if I refused to obey counsel." The problem is that this was published in the Anti-Polygamy Standard, and the friend is not identified. A better source of Phoebe's feelings is her 1880 autobiography, which states, "When the principles of polygamy was first taught, I thought it was the most wicked thing I ever heard of. Consequently, I supposed it to the best of my ability until I became sick and wretched. As soon, however, as I became convinced that it originated as a revelation from God through Joseph, and knowing him to be a prophet, I wrestled with my Heavenly Father in fervent prayers to be guided aright at that all-important moment of my life. The answer came. Peace was given to my mind. I knew it was the will of God, and from that time to the present, I have sought to faithfully honor the patriarchal law. Of Joseph, my testimony is that he was one of the greatest prophets the Lord ever called, that he lived for the redemption of mankind and died a martyr for the truth."
Speaking of those who fight against plural marriage, Helen Mar Kimball said, quote, "The conflict is between them and our God, who has never forsaken his people. But he does not expect us to sit quietly down and fold our hands in idleness, while our enemies are publishing their outrageous falsehoods to blind the eyes of the weak and credulous to the most glorious truths of heaven, and to throw ignominy and dishonor upon our people, as our slanderers are on the road to perdition, but to use every honorable means to defend ourselves against their vile attacks." Close quote. And this video is made in her honor. The main purpose of this video presentation is to refute the conspiracy narrative which claims that Joseph fought polygamy. This presentation is historical in nature and will not address the doctrinal side of plural marriage. However, I will be doing a separate video presentation called "Why Plural Marriage Was Restored in Nauvoo" based on never-before-seen research on the doctrine and the revelation on plural marriage in Nauvoo as taught by the prophet Joseph Smith, and scriptural reasons for understanding it. True doctrine understood inspires faith and strengthens testimony. The reason we should all consider this current movement of polygamy denial, or the conspiracy narrative, a really big deal with serious spiritual consequences is because those behind this current movement also believe and are seeking to persuade members to believe the following: that the church was rejected before Joseph died and lost the Melchizedek priesthood, the 12 apostles usurped the leadership of the church, that Brigham Young conspired to kill Joseph Smith for power and polygamy, the Temple Dhamma is a satanic, evil invention of Brigham Young, that Brigham Young changed the history of the church deceptively to pin the origins of plural marriage on Joseph Smith. Those behind this narrative piously pretend to be exposing the facts, while they mislead others with half-truths and emotional-based manipulation of fact. Consequently, the validity and necessity of temple covenants, priesthood blessings, family sealings, and more are suddenly left hanging by a thread. We need to ask ourselves, if this narrative is true, was our church founded on lies, adultery, and whoredoms? And if so, is any part of the church true today? Perhaps the intended purpose of the conspiracy narrative is to weaken faith and destroy testimonies in truth. Before I can proceed with this presentation, it is critical to discuss the importance of historical context and why it matters. To quote out of context is to remove a passage from its surrounding matter in such a way as to distort its meaning. Those who promote the conspiracy narrative, for lack of a better term, heavily rely upon carefully extrapolated quotes taken out of context while willfully ignoring historical data that doesn't fit their view. It is morally wrong, highly unethical, and intellectually dishonest to purposely misrepresent the historical record in order to mislead another person. The only way this debate over whether or not Joseph Smith's alleged public denials of polygamy amounts to the accusation that Brigham Young, not Joseph Smith, is the author of Mormon Polygamy can only be settled and properly understood by placing history into its proper context. Let me give you an example of an oft-repeated statement of the prophet Joseph Smith that is staged without context and without any clarifying information. You have probably all heard this quote, and that is why you're watching this video. The prophet Joseph Smith did make this public denial in 1844 when he said, quote, "What a thing it is for a man to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives when I can find only one," close quote. Later in this video, we will analyze this statement in its proper context and while providing all the data and facts surrounding the statement. Of this misunderstood statement, many will ignorantly and perhaps a little self-righteously exclaim, "To believe that Joseph Smith was a polygamist is to believe that he was a liar, and I choose to believe that he was telling the truth." They repeat this statement tirelessly in order to ignore or accept any additional information that would alter their preferred position. From a scholarly perspective, that has got to be one of the worst arguments I've ever heard. Unfortunately, it is another example of a false dilemma or illogical fallacy that I will explain later in the video. However, I do want to make it clear that I'm very sympathetic toward those who rightfully want to defend Joseph Smith's name and character from the charge of polygamy as it is practiced today. I say that because it must be understood that this is not celestial plural marriage. This is polygamy as the world knows it. It is polygamy without purpose and without authority. It is debased, immoral, lustful, and it is wrong. Celestial marriage, or eternal plural marriage, as found in the Revelation, is fundamentally different from what is commonly referred to on modern terms as polygamy. The premise of modern polygamy is a harem, just many women. The basis for celestial plural marriage focuses instead on multiplying the priesthood, and this will be discussed in greater detail in part 2 of this video series. Whenever a truth is revealed from heaven, the Lord always gives a reason for understanding it. For example, Bishop Newell K. Whitney was not a man that readily accepted every doctrine and would question the prophet very closely upon principles if not made clear to his understanding. Like several others, he was doubtful concerning the righteousness of this celestial order. So the prophet told him to go and inquire of the Lord concerning it, and he would receive a testimony for himself. Bishop Whitney and his wife unitedly sought the Lord for a testimony whether or not this principle was from him, and they ever after bore testimony that they received a manifestation that was so powerful that they could not mistake it. Elder Erastus Snow said, "Many outside the system cannot understand plural marriage because, quote, they are governed by their passions and not by principles, and it is the hardest thing in the world for them to be convinced that this people are governed by principles," close quote. I want to give you an example of who and what helped to perpetuate the conspiracy narrative. First, we need to understand who is Rob Farthingham. Rob is a former church employee who worked for the church for 9 years. 2 years ago, Rob made this YouTube video called First Polygamist, Joseph or Brigham. In this video, Rob does what every anti-Mormon has done for decades. He presents a very distorted and fragmented view and explanation of the sources in order to convince his audience that Brigham Young was the author of Mormon Plural Marriage, not Joseph Smith. Rob even makes the astonishing allegation that the church has hidden or covered up these facts. However, truth always has a way of revealing itself. And finally, after 2 years of this video destroying faith and testimony of thousands of members of the church, Rob finally admitted the following. Let me play the interview.
I think I try to be realistic about the limitations of my understanding. And even in the Joseph and Brigham video, I mean, it's fair to say that the evidence that is available that supports the traditional narrative about Joseph Smith being a polygamist vastly outweighs anything I was able to accumulate and present to present the other side of things. From my perspective, I wasn't trying to be exhaustive. And I said, listen, let's be clear, there is persuasive evidence on both sides to make the case for both sides. The question is the evidence trustworthy?
And what is interesting about this interview is that Rob admits 2 things. Number 1, his understanding of the facts was very limited, which I agree with. Number 2, the evidence that is available that supports the traditional narrative vastly outweighs anything he was able to accumulate and present. That is a remarkable admission that we cannot ignore. I'm thankful for Rob's honesty finally. But as we know, ideas have consequences, and Rob's video is still being used as a theological weapon against anyone who dares to support and defend the overwhelming evidence in favor of the traditional narrative. The purpose of this presentation is to offer a complete refutation of the polygamy denial narrative, also known as the conspiracy narrative, using real history, real facts, and real data. More than denying that Joseph Smith ever wrote the revelation on celestial plural marriage, as found in Doctrine and Covenants 132, detractors even contend that Brigham Young, not Joseph Smith, was the author of Section 132, and that it was written after the death of the prophet. However, there exists irrefutable evidence that the revelation on celestial marriage was put into writing on July 12, 1843, and that Joseph Smith knew as early as 1831 that plural marriage was to be restored. Believing that Brigham Young was the author of Section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants requires you to discount multiple testimonies which state the opposite. There are literally volumes of accounts given by the early saints testifying that the revelation contained in Doctrine and Covenants 132 was revealed by the Lord to the prophet Joseph Smith. Brian Hells again explains the provenance of Section 132 in this video excerpt.
Plural Marriage, now D&C 132. William Clayton recorded in his journal on July 12, 1843, "This a.m., I wrote a revelation consisting of 10 pages on the order of the priesthood, showing the designs in Moses, Abraham, David, and Solomon having many wives and concubines." Joseph C. Kingsbury reported the next day, "Newell K. Whitney handed me a revelation and asked me to make a copy of it. I did so." Clayton later testified, "The copy made by Joseph C. Kingsbury is a true and correct copy of the original in every respect. The Kingsbury copy is available for inspection today. There are no signs of changes or edits." The provenance of D&C 132 is very good, with multiple witnesses and copies now available to show that the original dictation was not changed. It was given on July 12, 1843, copied the next day, read to the High Council a month later. It was kept by Newell K. Whitney, with Willard Richards making a copy and later Horace Whitney making a second copy, before it was delivered to Brigham Young in 1847 and him publishing it 5 years later. Multiple individuals left records of seeing the revelation. The top 3 were not associated with the Utah Church. 6 men recalled that it was read before the Nauvoo High Council. Leonard Sobey had left the church completely, but he signed an affidavit recalling the event and declaring the 1852 published revelation was the same one he heard read to the High Council in 1843. Anyone who says Joseph Smith's statements support he was a monogamist are ignoring this document and advancing a false narrative.
William Clayton later made this bold declaration. He said, quote, "Now I say to you, as I'm ready to testify to all the world, and on which testimony I'm most willing to meet all the Latter-day Saints and all apostates in time and through all eternity, I did write the revelation on celestial marriage given through the prophet Joseph Smith on the 12th day of July, 1843. However, the vast majority of members of the church are unaware of the fact that the prophet Joseph Smith was forbidden by the Lord to make the practice public after he made at least one attempt to teach the doctrine to the saints, and it was rejected. When the prophet Joseph Smith tried to introduce the doctrine of plural marriage, it was rejected by the saints, and Joseph Lee Robinson wrote, quote, "When the prophet went to his dinner, as it might be expected, several of the first women of the church collected at the prophet's house with his wife and said thus to the prophet Joseph, 'Oh, Mr. Smith, you've done it now. It will never do. It is all but blasphemy. You must take back what you have said today. It is outrageous. It would ruin us as a people.' So, in the afternoon session, Smith again took the stand, according to Robinson, and said, 'Brethren and sisters, I take back what we said this morning and leave it as though there had been nothing said.'" Closed quote. Joseph Smith, trying to reveal the doctrine found in Section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants publicly and being rejected, is actually what led to this famous quote by the prophet, where he said, quote, "I have tried for a number of years to get the minds of the saints prepared to receive the things of God, but we frequently see some of them, after suffering all they have for the work of God, will fly to pieces like glass as soon as anything comes that is contrary to their traditions. They cannot stand the fire at all. How many will be able to abide a celestial law and go through and receive their exaltation? I am unable to say, as many are called, but few are chosen." Closed quote. Fearing further resistance and harmful backlash from the general church membership, Joseph Smith began to teach the revelation on plural marriage exclusively to his closest and most trusted friends and associates through confidential and personal interviews and through the careful guidance of the Spirit. Samuel W. Richards remembered, quote, "I heard him, Joseph Smith, teach it, plural marriage, privately to quite a number at different times, that is, in the aggregate, to quite a number, but not too many at a time, and I never did hear him preach it or teach it in what would be called a public manner," close quote. William Clayton also testified, quote, "After the revelation on celestial marriage was written, Joseph continued his instructions privately on the doctrine to myself and others, and during the last year of his life we were scarcely ever together alone, but he was talking on the subject and explaining that doctrine and principles connected with it. He appeared to enjoy great liberty and freedom in his teachings, and also to find great relief in having a few to whom he could unbosom his feelings on that great and glorious subject." Close quote. Joseph F. Smith also testified, quote, "The great and glorious principle of plural marriage was first revealed to Joseph Smith in 1831, but being forbidden to make it public or to teach it as a doctrine of the gospel at that time, he confided the facts to only a very few of his intimate associates." Close quote. Zina Huntington also bore her testimony and said, quote, "We hardly dared speak of it. The very walls had ears. We spoke of it only in whispers." Close quote. It is important to understand that keeping the revelation and practice of plural marriage secret and out of public view was a matter of life or death for the saints. Joseph Smith's first plural wife in Nauvoo was Louisa Beeman, daughter of Alva Beeman, who in 1827 had helped the prophet preserve the gold plates for mob elements before they were translated. Joseph Bates Noble, whose sister was Louisa, performed the first plural marriage of Joseph Smith on April 5, 1841. The prophet dictated the words of the ceremony to Noble and later cautioned him, quote, "In revealing this to you, I have placed my life in your hands. Therefore, do not in an evil hour betray me to my enemies." Close quote. Reflecting back on the events in Nauvoo, Apostle Orson Hyde related, quote, "What would it have done for us if they had known that many of us had more than one wife when we lived in Illinois? They would have broken us up, doubtless worse than they did." Close quote. In order for faithful Mormon leaders to deny plural marriage publicly with a clear conscience, they developed a code for speaking using double meanings. George A. Smith testified, quote, "Anyone who will read carefully the denials, as they are termed, will see clearly that they denounce adultery, fornication, brutal lust, and the teachings of plurality of wives by those who were not commanded to do so." Close quote. Many have criticized or been concerned by the secrecy with which the prophet Joseph Smith instituted plural marriage without appreciating the realities of the dangers involved. William Clayton later wrote, quote, "When assailed by their enemies and accused of practicing things which were really not countenanced in the church, they were justified in denying those imputations, and at the same time avoiding the avowal of such doctrine as were not yet intended for the world. Polygamy in the ordinary and Asiatic sense of the term never was and is not now a tenet of the Latter-day Saints. That which Joseph and Hiram denounced was altogether different to the order of celestial marriage, including a plurality of wives. Joseph and Hiram were consistent in their action against the false doctrines of polygamy and spiritual wifism, instigated by the devil and advocated by men who did not comprehend sound doctrine nor the purity of the celestial marriage covenant which God revealed for the holiest of purposes." Close quote. The prophet Joseph Smith on one occasion even stated that he was willing to die for this revelation. He said, quote, "If I have to die for any revelation God has given through me, I would as readily die for this one as any other. And I sometimes think that I shall have to die for it. It may be that I shall have to forfeit my life to it, and if this has to be so, amen." Closed quote. In Nauvoo, you have celestial plural marriage that was introduced privately to a select number who'd proven faithful. Whenever true doctrine is revealed from heaven, Satan sets up a counterfeit. Satan delights, perhaps above all else, in perverting that which is sacred. Satan's counterfeit for celestial plural marriage was John C. Bennett's spiritual wifeism, which was sex without marriage with multiple women who men said were their spiritual wives, so it was okay. John C. Bennett was a doctor who performed abortions on women who he got pregnant. So you can imagine that when some unfaithful elders of the church were seduced by John C. Bennett's spiritual wife doctrine and whoredoms, that Joseph Smith spoke openly and publicly, denouncing that as an awful abomination. So every public denial of polygamy, Joseph always preferenced by saying spiritual wifeism. I will give an example of this later in the presentation. In order to advance the Joseph fought polygamy narrative, you will notice that the past quotes of Joseph denying spiritual wifeism are used without giving the context or explaining the difference between spiritual wifery and celestial plural marriage. Enemies of the prophet Joseph Smith in Nauvoo also falsely equated plural marriage with the spiritual wife system and polygamy, and unjustly inferred that Joseph Smith was implicated in that practice. The prophet abhorred and denounced those wicked counterfeit practices in public and in private. The revelation which the prophet received, however, related to the contrasting subject of eternal plural marriage covenants, together with the keys and authority to seal marriage for eternity. Members of the church were restricted by severe penalties to one wife, unless in individual cases where the Lord shall by revelation through the prophet Joseph Smith direct otherwise. Were the saints to vary from the basic law of monogamy except by specific commandment through the prophet and president of the church, they would come under the curse and condemnation of God's holy law. Joseph Smith made it clear that to practice plural marriage except in the way ordained by divine law was a serious transgression of such magnitude that it jeopardized the offender's eternal salvation. Both Joseph Smith and Hiram strongly denounced the unlawful practice of these types of plural marriages. The prophet Joseph Smith followed this policy in dealing with those who taught and practiced the principle of plural marriage without authority to do so. Having been incredibly formed of an elder named Hiram Brown, who was preaching polygamy without authority, the prophet Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith published a notice in the Times and Seasons which read, quote, "This is to notify him and the church in general that he has been cut off from the church for his iniquity." Close quote. Why was Hiram Brown excommunicated? The correctness of the principle did not justify the practice unless it was commanded of God through the living prophet. It was for this reason that the right to enter into plural marriage was controlled by Joseph Smith and later Brigham Young. And for all plural marriages or sealings of Nauvoo, Joseph Smith alone held the keys. The same action taken against Hiram Brown would have been taken at any period of the existence of the church, even by Brigham Young. The priesthood alone also never entitled a man to more than one wife. And when another elder taught that having a certain priesthood entitled a man to have as many wives as he pleased, Hiram Smith wrote in response to that claim the following. He said, quote, "I say unto you that man teaches false doctrine, for there is no such doctrine taught here, neither is there any such thing practiced here. Any man that is found teaching privately or publicly any such doctrine is culpable and will stand a chance to be brought before the High Council and lose his license and membership also. Therefore, he had better be aware what he is about." Close quote. The law of God governing marriage in every dispensation has been consistent. A man may legally have but one living wife at a time, unless the Lord directs otherwise through the constituted channels of his holy priesthood. On the basis of these points, those who were teaching or practicing any form of polygamy contrary to the way marked out by the Lord was severed from the church. Elder Orson Pratt stressed that without such a command, they were strictly limited to the one-wife doctrine. Otherwise, says the Lord, they shall hearken unto these things. That is, without any express command, they should hearken to the law, limiting them to one wife. Continuing, he explained, quote, "In the early rise of the church, the Lord gave no commandment unto any of his servants authorizing them to take more than one wife, but on the contrary, said unto them that they should give heed to that which was written in the Book of Mormon, Therefore, they were under the strictest obligations to confine themselves to one wife until a commandment came to the contrary, which the Lord did not see proper to give unto any of them until about 13 years after the first organization of the church. The church, therefore, are still restricted by the severest penalties to one wife, according to the Book of Mormon, unless in individual cases where the Lord shall by revelation direct otherwise." Closed quote. Plural relationships improperly formed were adulterous. Helen Mar Kimball, a plural wife of Joseph Smith at Nauvoo, stated that there was only one true course which the Lord has marked out for the practice of plural marriage, and no other will be acceptable to him. To live with more than one wife, except you are sealed by one holding the priesthood and authority from the great master, is nothing less than adultery. Closed quote. Before continuing with the presentation, it must be acknowledged that those who perpetuate the conspiracy narrative also make the astonishing allegation that Brigham Young and other apostles deceptively changed this part of the historical record. I appreciate Brian Hell's specific response to Rob Farthingham's video concerning this matter.
Through the Joseph Smith Papers Project, all of the changes have been fully identified, and no smoking guns have been found by critics who scour the Joseph Smith Papers Project publications. The video is very concerned about one change, wherein an entry in Joseph Smith's journal was highly edited before publication. The original entry reads in yellow, "Evening at home," and walked up and down the street with my scribe, gave instructions to try those persons who were preaching or teaching the doctrine of plurality of wives on this law. Joseph forbids it and the practice thereof. No man shall have but one wife. The pink shows the editorial expansion, which reads, "For according to the law, I hold the keys of this power in these last days, for there is never but one on earth at a time on whom the power and its keys are conferred. And I have consistently said, no man shall have but one wife at a time, unless the Lord directs otherwise." Fotheringham rejects the editorial changes and presents the last three sentences of the quote as if it is a blanket statement from Joseph Smith condemning any form of a plurality of wives. But the video ignores three important words that explain why Joseph Smith is condemning those who were preaching and teaching the doctrine of a plurality of wives. Joseph Smith justifies his condemnation of polygamy by saying, "on this law." What law could he be referring to? It isn't Illinois or federal statutes, because they did not condemn plural marriages performed by religious authority. State laws condemned sexual relations outside of legal marriages. So only when the plural marriage was consummated would governmental laws apply. What other law justified Joseph Smith from rejecting plural marriage? The July 12, 1843 revelation, now D&C 132, identifies one man as controlling the authority to seal marriages, monogamous or polygamous. On that law, as the one man holding those priesthood keys, Joseph Smith controlled all religious marriages, and he could disallow any he chose to disallow.
In addition to what Brian Hales explained, those in the Joseph Fought Polygamy movement attempt to mislead and misrepresent the facts by presenting Joseph Smith's October 5, 1843 original journal entry as proof of a smoking gun that the history was changed deceptively. The person who made this graphic wrote at the top, "Brigham's edited a version," and then added a side-by-side comparison and labeled the original journal entry as Joseph Smith's unedited journal. But by examining the original handwritten, not typescript journal entry actually proves the opposite of what this person is trying to allege. Let me explain. Joseph Smith's October 5, 1843 original journal entry was written by Willard Richards, not Joseph Smith, as Rob Farthingham and others have inferred. Why is this significant? The prophet Joseph Smith commanded that the records of the church be kept, preserved, and accurately transmitted. In Nauvoo, 6 scribes worked round the clock, burning candles until midnight to bring the history up to date. The prophet also charged these scribes with the duty of updating the history after his death. Joseph Smith recorded, "I told Phelps a dream, that the history must go ahead before anything else. Then Joseph said, 'Here, let me prophesy. The time will come when, if you neglect to do this thing, you will fall by the hands of unrighteous men.'" One of those trusted scribes and historians was Willard Richards. In November 1841, the prophet Joseph Smith wrote, quote, "I have been searching all my life to find a man after my own heart whom I could trust with my business in all things, and I have found him. Dr. Willard Richards is the man." Closed quote. You will notice that after the word wife in Joseph Smith's original journal entry, that no punctuation is used signaling the end of the sentence, and instead there are several lines left blank, meaning that Willard Richards had not finished the record and intended to fill in the details when he had more documents and first-hand involvement to be able to add details remembered but not necessarily recorded at the time. He wasn't changing the original journal, but this was a developmental editing that would include being sure the doctrine was presented properly pre-publication, which was well within the purview of the apostles. What seems silly is if they were revising deceptively, they would not have said they were revising the history, and they would not have taken so much care to ensure that the original was preserved. But continuing on, publicly addressing John C. Bennett's assertions regarding secret wives also posed a significant challenge for the Relief Society leaders in Nauvoo. How to openly refute Bennett's false claims without acknowledging or explaining the practice of plural marriage in a public setting. The Times and Seasons published a statement signed by 19 prominent members of the Nauvoo Relief Society in which the women distanced themselves from Bennett's activities and accusations. On February 26, 1844, a man named Erasmus F. Bostwick was brought before the mayor's court in Nauvoo and fined for slander. Bostwick had claimed that Hiram Smith had spiritual wives and that many women in Nauvoo were involved with spiritual wifery, promiscuity, and prostitution. Voice of Innocence gave Relief Society women means for responding to insulting rumors and the allegations of Bostwick and others. They wrote, quote, "We, the undersigned members of the Ladies' Relief Society and married females, do certify and declare that we know of no system of marriage being practiced in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, save the one contained in the Book of Doctrine and Covenants, and we give this certificate to the public to show that J.C. Bennett's secret wife system is a disclosure of his own make." Closed quote. Of the Article of Innocence, Eliza R. Snow wrote, quote, "At the time the Sisters of the Relief Society signed our article, I was married to the prophet Joseph Smith. We made no allusion to any other system of marriage than Bennett's. His was prostitution, and it was truly his, and he succeeded in pandering his course on the credulity of the unsuspecting by making them believe that he was thus authorized by the prophet. In those articles there is no reference to divine plural marriage. We aimed to put down the opposite." Close quote. Ultimately, the introduction of the doctrine of plural marriage to the Nauvoo High Council in 1843 was the first in a string of crucial events that ultimately led to the death of the prophet Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram. On Saturday, August 12, 1843, Hiram read the revelation to the Nauvoo High Council. Austin Cowles was one of those in the High Council that day who would leave the church as a result of Hiram's reading of the revelation found in Doctrine and Covenants 132, and he would later produce affidavits opposing plural marriage. Hiram was apparently unaware of the poor reception the revelation had received in the High Council. He then took the revelation to William Law. Upon request, Hiram left the revelation with William Law to study. William's wife, Jane Law, also studied the revelation that night. Like Austin Cowles, William and Jane Law produced affidavits opposing the revelation. After reading the revelation, Law went to the prophet Joseph Smith and retorted, quote, "There is a revelation in the Doctrine and Covenants just the contrary to this," close quote, to which Joseph Smith replied, quote, "That was given when the church was in its infancy. Then it was all right to feed the people on milk, but now it is necessary to give them strong meat," close quote. William Law was reluctant to accept the doctrine and pleaded with Joseph not to teach it. He later wrote in his diary, quote, "Polygamy was of the devil and Smith should put it down. The doctrine of polygamy paralyzes the nerve, chills the currents of the heart, and drives the brain to almost madness." Close quote. While Joseph Smith faithfully took upon himself the great risks involved in teaching the doctrine regardless of the cost, William Law declared, quote, "If an angel from heaven was to reveal to me that a man should have more than one wife, and if it were in my power, I would kill him." Close quote. The continued doubts and growing antagonism directed by William Law towards the revelation of plural marriage led to a bitter feud and open conflict on his part with the prophet Joseph Smith. And on January 8, 1844, Joseph Smith removed William Law from the first presidency. On April 18, 1844, Law and his wife were excommunicated from the church along with his brother Wilson, the Higbee brothers Chauncey L. and Francis M. and Dr. Robert D. Foster. Another church leader, Nauvoo High Council President William Marks, became deeply conflicted as well. I cite this history briefly in order to illustrate the hostility and persecution that Joseph Smith faced after introducing and teaching the doctrine of plural marriage, even among members of his own first presidency. So why the dissension and persecution? The prophet Joseph Smith knew that the practice of this principle would be the hardest trial the saints would ever have to test their faith. Brigham Young commented, "It was the first time in my life that I had desired the grave." Heber C. Kimball said if it had been his death sentence, he could not have felt worse. Hyrum Smith confided to a friend that he fought that principle until the Lord showed him it was true. John Taylor recalled that it was one of the greatest crosses that ever was taken up by any set of men since the world stood. Orson Pratt referred to his own trial in regard to this matter in Nauvoo and said it was because he got his information from a wicked source, from those disaffected, but as soon as he learned the truth, he was satisfied. Nonetheless, the prophet had been commanded to practice and teach privately the principle of celestial or plural marriage, but polygamy was illegal in the state of Illinois. Technically, the prophet Joseph Smith and others were practicing celestial marriage and not traditional polygamy, but to the state this would still have been looked upon as criminal. Imagine being commanded by the Lord to break the laws of the state. But as Peter in the New Testament declared, we ought to obey God rather than men. In his own defense, the prophet Joseph Smith said, quote, "They accuse me of polygamy and of being a false prophet. I am no false prophet. I am no impostor. I've had no dark revelations. I've had no revelations from the devil. I've made no revelations. I have not got anything up myself. The same God that has thus far dictated and directed me and inspired me and strengthened me in this work gave me this revelation and commandment on celestial and plural marriage, and the same God commanded me to obey it. He said to me that unless I accept it and introduce it and practice it, I together with my people should be damned and cut off from this time henceforth. And they say if I do so, and so they will kill me. What shall I do? What shall I do? If I do not practice it, I shall be damned with all my people. If I do teach it and practice it and urge it, they say they will kill me, and I know that they will." Close quote. Now we reach the crisis moment. In the spring of 1844, Joseph Smith was alerted by two young men, Dennison L. Harris and Robert Scott, of a secret movement to take both his life and the lives of several other leading men in the church, including Hyrum Smith. These young men had been personally invited to the secret meetings by the conspirators. Risking their own lives, the boys attended 3 of the meetings as spies and brought to Joseph Smith a report of what they had witnessed, including a recounting of the requirement that everyone present at the meeting take an oath to be willing to take the life of Joseph Smith. In addition to the testimonies of these young men, 2 other men went before the justice of the peace to swear out an affidavit concerning their knowledge of those who had secretly combined to murder the prophet and his brother. Roughly 200 men had sworn an oath to kill the prophet Joseph Smith and Hyrum. Included in the affidavit were the names of the leaders of the plot: Chauncey L. Higbee, R.D. Foster, Joseph H. Jackson, and William and Wilson Law, corresponding with the witnesses of the 2 young men. However, the name of another leader, an active conspirator, was finally revealed: Austin Cowles, a current member of the Nauvoo High Council. When Robert and Dennison refused to take the oath to kill Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram, they were threatened at knife point, and one of the conspirators said, "If you do not take the oath, we will cut your throats." They were forced to the basement and locked in the cellar. Once more they were told to take the oath or die. Then, by divine providence, one man reasoned that the boys' fathers would come looking for them, and if found dead, their murderous plot would be discovered. Though spared, Dennison and Robert were threatened with certain death if they revealed what had transpired in the meetings or who had participated, and with that they were escorted from the building. The Sadducees and Pharisees used the Gentile Roman court authorities to bring public charges against the Son of God in order to solicit public outcry for Jesus Christ to be condemned and sentenced to die. In a striking parallel, in May of 1844, in an effort to drag the prophet Joseph Smith into the public square and to expose him to his enemies and public opinion and the law of the state of Illinois, William Law and Robert Foster brought a legal suit against the prophet Joseph in Carthage court for living in adultery with one of his plural wives, Maria Lawrence. However, the prophet Joseph Smith publicly denied the charge of adultery, and this is the context for the extrapolated quote, "What a thing for a man to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives when I can find only one," close quote. However, in order to understand this statement, we need to place it back into its full context. The statement in its full context reads, quote, "I had not been married scarcely 5 minutes and made one proclamation of the gospel before it was reported that I had 7 wives. I mean to live and proclaim the truth as long as I can. This new holy prophet, William Law, has gone to Carthage and swore that I had told him that I was guilty of adultery. This spiritual wifeism? Why, a man dares not speak or wink for fear of being accused of this. A man asked me whether the commandment was given that a man may have 7 wives, and now the new prophet has charged me with adultery. I never had any fuss with these men until the Female Relief Society brought out the paper against adulterers and adulteresses. Dr. Goforth was invited into Law's clique, and Dr. Foster and the clique were dissatisfied with that document, and they rush away and leave the church and conspire to take away my life. And because I will not countenance such wickedness, they proclaim that I have been a true prophet, but that I am now a fallen prophet. What a thing it is for a man to be accused of adultery and having 7 wives when I can find only one," closed quote. This statement refers to Joseph Smith's well-known declaration on May 26, 1844, in his public address called Address Against the Dissenters of Nauvoo. In light of the circumstances under which they were spoken, Joseph's words were carefully chosen in order to protect the saints from mounting tensions and incitement to violence. The prophet Joseph Smith truthfully denied being guilty of adultery and of John C. Bennett's spiritual wifeism. It was also true that according to the law and the state of Illinois, that Joseph Smith only had one legal wife. Joseph Smith and the small group of his trusted friends in his anointed quorum who had privately entered into the plural marriage covenants considered their relationships to be holy matrimony, sealed or confined by divine authority and approval. In this public denial, the prophet never denied being sealed by the authority of the priesthood given to him by God in the celestial marriage covenant. This public statement was even preserved by the apostles after Joseph Smith's death. Logically speaking, if this statement were a denial of the practice of plural marriage and Brigham Young changed the history of the church to pin the authorship of Mormon polygamy on Joseph Smith, this statement would have been destroyed. Instead, it was carefully preserved, and it was even published in the history of the church by Brigham Young. It must be understood that at this time the statement was given, Nauvoo was the largest city in Illinois. Hence, counterfeiters, blacklegs, bootleggers, slave traders, gamblers, and every other disreputable type of person found their way there, trying to exploit the possibilities for dishonest profits and to deceive sometimes naive converts who had come from far and near. Because of that underworld, but worse still because of the apostates living there who now hated the church, including the 200 men who'd taken a blood oath to take Joseph Smith's life. The life of Joseph Smith and the lives of the saints were in constant jeopardy. The state of Missouri still had extradition orders for Joseph Smith if caught committing a crime. There was also the problem of a reward offered by the Missourians. They had placed a price on Joseph's head. They would pay $1,000 for his delivery, as with John the Baptist, on a platter. The very act of denying publicly William Law's charge of living in adultery with one of his plural wives saved his life that day and the lives of the saints. The prophet Joseph Smith taught, quote, "It is not always wise to relate all truth. Even Jesus, the Son of God, had to refrain from doing so, and had to restrain his feelings many times for the safety of himself and his followers, and had to conceal the righteous purposes of his heart in relation to many things pertaining to his Father's kingdom." Close quote. While the prophet Joseph Smith was perfectly right and truthful in denying the infamous charges repeated by his enemies, he was under no obligation and had no right to announce to the world at that time the doctrine of celestial plural marriage. The body of the church at the time knew little or nothing of it. As a specific illustration to this point, Abraham lied to the Egyptians in telling them that Sarah was his sister in order to protect his life, instead of telling them that she was his wife, and according to the book of Abraham, he was directed by the Lord to do so. Another illustration. Jesus took Peter, James, and John into the mountain, and there met with Moses, Elias, and the glory of God shone about them. And these two angels talked with Jesus, and the voice of God was heard proclaiming him to be the Son of God. After this glorious vision, as Jesus and his companions were descending the mountains, Jesus said, quote, "Tell the vision to no man until the Son of Man be risen from the dead." Close quote. Now suppose one of the apostles had turned from the truth before the Son of Man was risen from the dead, and under a wicked and lying spirit should charge that Jesus and some of his favorite apostles went up to the mountain and there met Moses and Elias. If the other apostles denounced that as an infamous falsehood, would they be untruthful? No, they would not. Or would they be under the obligation, when denying the falsehood of the apostate, to break the commandments of the Lord had given them by relating just what had happened on the mountain? No, it would have been a breach of the Master's strict commandment for them to do that. In order for something to be a lie, the person must have the right to the information. In other words, it is not a lie to withhold information from someone who has no right to that information. Despite these examples, many will still ignorantly claim Joseph Smith would be a hypocrite for what they perceive as, quote, lying. However, Abraham was commanded to offer his son Isaac. Nevertheless, it was written, "Thou shalt not kill." Abraham, however, did not refuse, and it was accounted unto him for righteousness. The prophet Joseph Smith taught this eternal principle, quote, "God said, 'Thou shalt not kill.' At another time he said, 'Thou shalt utterly destroy.' This is the principle on which the government of heaven is conducted, by revelation adapted to the circumstances in which the children of the kingdom are placed. Whatever God requires is right, no matter what it is, although we may not see the reason thereof till long after the events transpire." Close quote. And now that the events have transpired, we see clearly the reasons for his public denials. And when their bogus charge of adultery they made against the prophet was not substantiated, their fierce opposition was forced out into the open, and they joined with the avowed enemies of the saints outside of Nauvoo. These apostates imported a printing press into Nauvoo and proposed publishing a paper that would be called the Nauvoo Expositor. On June 7, 1844, the first and only issue of the Nauvoo Expositor thoroughly vilified the prophet for his practice of plural marriage. A close friend of the prophet Joseph Smith, George Lobb, recorded the following. He said, quote, "Brother Joseph called a meeting at his house and told us that God showed him in an open vision in daylight," meaning that this was not just something he had conjured up in his dreams of the night, that if he did not destroy the printing press, that it would cause the blood of the saints to flow in the streets, and by this was that evil destroyed. Speaking of those who returned to report that they had destroyed the press and other materials as ordered by the city council, Joseph Smith recorded, quote, "I told them that they had done right and that not a hair of their heads should be hurt for it." Close quote. No doubt not all believed this. He did not add then, which he could have, that although he had by that act preserved the saints' lives for a time, he had done so at the cost of his own. And on June 27, 1844, with the help of the mob and Governor Ford, who had their own political and diabolical reasons for killing the prophet and his brother, William Law's murderous plot was carried out at Carthage jail. The prophet Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram were murdered in cold blood by their enemies. It is important to understand that the truth has already been established. The truth of the doctrine of plural marriage was sealed with the testimony of the blood of the prophet who was killed over this principle. According to present research, the names of all of Joseph Smith's plural wives have been revealed, and their testimonies are recorded in heaven and on earth. They were righteous women who were sufficient witnesses to establish the truth upon the earth in such a manner that it can never be forgotten. The most vocal and documented witnesses of plural marriage as taught by Joseph Smith are the women, and no one has been able to explain that away. The Lord always sends his words through witnesses who testify of him. 2 or more witnesses give a binding voice in the testimony of truth. As a student and a vast researcher of early Mormon history and doctrine, I believe it is critical, as Latter-day Saints, that we learn from our history to avoid being deceived. History is prophecy for the future. The same apostates living in Nauvoo after the death of the prophet Joseph Smith are the same kind we have today. What happened in Nauvoo after the death of the prophet Joseph Smith, I believe, is a modern-day parallel to what is taking place right now. Before the martyrdom of the prophet Joseph Smith, William Law had created his own church called the True Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but his church utterly failed shortly after its organization. And a year before the martyrdom, on March 27, 1843, the prophet dictated a letter to Sidney Rigdon, frankly expressing his feelings towards his counselor. Joseph Smith stated in this letter to Sidney, quote, "I am, sir, honest when I say that I believe and am laboring under the fullest conviction that you are actually practicing deception and wickedness against me and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and that you are in connection with John C. Bennett and George W. Robinson in the whole of their abominable practices and seeking to destroy me and this people, and that you are combining with our enemies and the murderous Missourians." Close quote. Some 5 months later, on Sunday, August 13, 1843, Joseph Smith again made negative remarks concerning Sidney Rigdon in a meeting in Nauvoo. He said, quote, "We have had certain traitors in this city who have been writing falsehoods to Missouri, and there is a certain man in this city who has made a covenant to betray and give me up to the Missourians. That man is no other than Sidney Rigdon." The prophet publicly withdrew his fellowship from Rigdon and asked the saints to proclaim it abroad, that he would no longer accept him as his counselor. There was a unanimous vote that Sidney Rigdon be disfellowshipped and his license demanded. But despite being rejected by the prophet Joseph Smith, and upon learning of the martyrdom, Sidney Rigdon brazenly returned to Nauvoo on August 3, 1844, asserting a right to take charge of the church and taking a stand in direct opposition to the instructions of the prophet Joseph Smith to complete the Nauvoo temple. Sidney Rigdon also uttered the false prophecy that, quote, "not another stone will ever be laid on the temple," close quote. Brigham Young and other devoted saints, on the other hand, were fully dedicated to finishing the work that Joseph had begun and to carry out the instructions to build the kingdom of God. The Lord stated at the Nauvoo temple revelation, quote, "And again, verily I say unto you, I command you again to build a house in my name, even in this place Nauvoo, that you may prove yourselves unto me, that you are faithful in all things whatsoever I command you, that I may bless you and crown you with honor, immortality, and eternal life." In consequence of being rejected by the membership of the church, Sidney Rigdon initiated an inflammatory campaign wherein he secretly contacted loyal members of the church to slander the prophet Joseph Smith, arguing that Joseph had become a fallen prophet and had suffered death as a result of his so-called revelation on polygamy. In consequence of these defamatory statements, charges of apostasy were made against Sidney Rigdon. He was excommunicated on September 8, 1844, and after expulsion from the church, Sidney Rigdon and 20 of his followers continued to teach that Joseph Smith was a fallen prophet who had transgressed the laws of God and was therefore rejected by God, and that was the reason he was shot to death by a mob of bitter enemies. Sidney Rigdon left Nauvoo and moved to Pittsburgh, where he established his own church. It is significant that Rigdon welcomed conspirator William Law into his church and made William E. McClellan one of his apostles. McClellan was another enemy of the prophet who had persisted since his excommunication in 1838 in proclaiming that Joseph had become a fallen prophet. Rigdon's church became only one of many churches founded by disaffected members of the church, and it too failed miserably in 1847. Despite the fact that prior to martyrdom, Joseph Smith placed the 12 apostles in the line of succession by conferring all of the keys of their holy priesthood upon them in the presence of credible witnesses, a man named James J. Strang, having only joined the church 4 months prior to the death of the prophet Joseph Smith on February 25, 1844, contrived a scheme to usurp the presidency of the church by claiming that he was the appointed successor to the prophet. He presented a hand-printed letter, which he claimed was written by Joseph Smith, naming him, James Strang, the rightful successor to the presidency of the church. He then attempted to bolster his claim, alleging that on June 27, 1844, an unidentified angel touched his head to authorize the ordination. It hardly seems conceivable that Strang would succeed in finding anyone to follow him, but by 1846, James Strang had organized his own Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, consisting mostly of excommunicated members of the original church. Strang even made the well-known adulterer and archenemy of Joseph Smith, John C. Bennett, a counselor in his presidency. Not surprisingly, the Strang Church met its demise in 1856, only 10 years after its organization. There are former members of the church presently who are attempting to fabricate schemes similar to James Strang in an effort to usurp authority from the current church. Incidentally, leading members of the movement to accuse Brigham Young of the murder of Joseph Smith and to advocate the conspiracy narrative that Joseph fought polygamy today believe that they too have received a divine appointment by angels, and they also profess to have received specialized ordinations to higher priesthood authority as leaders over the 144,000 spoken of in the scriptures. While they have been successful in drawing many hundreds of exploitable members after them, and in many cases destroying individual lives, testimonies, and families, their movements have largely failed and have only produced bitter fruits. A critical lesson to be learned from the James Strang story is how to identify false claims of authority and/or false claims of re-restoration of the priesthood. When James Strang began making his claim to angelic ordination, Orson Hyde shared that Strang was not the first to make such false claims. Others had made them before, and that Joseph Smith had taught that, quote, the priesthood being once established on earth with power to ordain others, no heavenly messenger will ever come to interfere with that power by ordaining any more, closed quote. In April of 1853, some of the former disciples of James Strang organized a new church. They called it the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the RLDS Church. The RLDS Church never adopted or taught any of the doctrines or ordinances restored by the prophet Joseph Smith with respect to baptism for the dead, temple ordinances, eternal marriages, and other ordinances crucial to exaltation in the afterlife. They even denied that the prophet ever received the revelation on eternal marriage, even for monogamous marriages. Those with the pretended authority to reorganize the church refrained from making derogatory remarks about the martyr Joseph Smith long enough to deceitfully convince his son, Joseph Smith III, to join the reorganized church in 1860, in which he was ordained president of the high priesthood. In 1860, the RLDS Church revolved around opposition to two central issues, plural marriage and Brigham Young. Ironically, most of the people who became early members of the reorganized church either had neglected to aid in the construction of the temple at all, or they later abandoned construction of the Nauvoo temple. The light and the Spirit of God can only be possessed through faithfulness and obedience to the requirements of heaven. It is worth emphasizing again that those who remained loyal to the prophet Joseph Smith persevered in spite of persecution and enemy interference to complete the Nauvoo temple. At no time did the Lord withdraw his hand from the saints. Divine providence was in their favor. The monumental efforts of the wicked to stop the completion of the temple were thwarted, and circumstances were overruled in favor of the saints and the Lord's cause. On December 10th, 1845, the first endowments in the Nauvoo temple were administered. During a period of 60 days, 5,595 saints received their sacred temple endowments as promised by the prophet Joseph Smith. In light of these facts, it shouldn't be surprising to learn that those in the modern-day Brigham killed Joseph and Joseph fought polygamy movements themselves have rejected all temple ordinances. The RLDS Church, known today as the Community of Christ, has never succeeded in its attempts to usurp authority away from Brigham Young or the original church. They did not adhere to the strict order of the priesthood to carry out the building of temples and administer saving ordinances for the living and the dead. The Lord revealed that the fullness of the priesthood is received within the walls of the sacred temple itself. The fullness of the priesthood is received through washings, anointings, solemn assemblies, oracles in holy places, ordinances, endowments, and sealings. In consequence, the RLDS Church could never be guided by revelation through priesthood authority or acknowledged by the Lord as his people. In 1983, Richard Howard, the first professionally trained historian of the RLDS Church, dropped a bombshell at a historical conference when he delivered irrefutable evidence connecting the origins of the doctrine of plural marriage in Nauvoo to the prophet Joseph Smith. A once cherished belief by members of the RLDS Church had now been proven false under the weight of historical evidence. The feud over polygamy in the RLDS Church became a decades-long struggle among their members who refused to accept defeat. Richard and Pamela Price became key players in the movement to keep a dying tradition on life support. Sadly, their persistence in republishing historically inaccurate falsehoods has infused lies into the hearts and minds of a growing number of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Richard and Pamela Price admit that they were encouraged by a letter written by RLDS Church President Israel A. Smith in 1956 to write a 3-volume book entitled Joseph Fought Polygamy. It seems clear that from the onset, authors Richard and Pamela Price did not set out to write a scholarly work based on sound historical evidence. Joseph Fought Polygamy was simply a reprinting of old arguments made by the RLDS Church dating back to the 1860s, using the same falsehoods placed into circulation in Nauvoo by dissenters who themselves hated Joseph Smith and coveted Brigham Young's leadership position. The entire foundation of the RLDS Church's identity is fundamentally anchored to the belief that Joseph Smith never practiced or taught the revelation on celestial plural marriage. The principal criticism of their work by trained historians without an agenda is the Price's very selective use of historical data as they present a one-sided, highly biased interpretation and distorted view of polygamy and President Brigham Young. And then, in order to deflect attention away from the growing body of historical evidence which proved that Joseph Smith did in fact teach and practice plural marriage in Nauvoo, evidence that posed a massive threat to the RLDS Church's claim to authority and rightful succession, another traditional member of the RLDS belief in the early 1990s conceived of a theory called the Carthage Conspiracy. The Carthage Conspiracy is a highly speculative theory that has never been proven true and remains lacking in credible evidence. The purpose of the theory, as told by one man, coincidentally named Joseph M. Smith, was to frame Brigham Young for the murder of the prophet. No one outside of a small group of RLDS supporters ever took this conspiracy seriously. Still, the disproven theory has now been resurrected by a small group of disgruntled ex-members of the church who hold strong feelings of disdain for President Brigham Young and the modern church. In fact, the documentary called Who Killed Joseph Smith, which was written and produced by a man who, according to his own words, was inspired by the Carthage conspiracy.
And Steve Sorensen. Hi, guys. Thanks for coming. Good. All right. So, Justin, you're the producer as well as the director. Mm-hmm. And Steve, you're the filmmaker.
Correct.
You brought it all together. A lot of people are curious, what's this film all about, and why did you guys get involved?
So I saw a film online called Carthage Conspiracy. Maybe you've seen it.
Uh-huh.
And it's interesting. It has great subject matter, but it's horribly done. Or at least the recording is. The presentation was probably good, but it's just super old.
It was VHS recording.
Yeah.
Quality. Yeah.
And I'm like,
right.
I was thinking of maybe approaching that guy and saying, hey, how did you come up with all this stuff? And reshooting that to get the information more clear. And so I wanted to figure that out, that movie. And so I talked to Steve about it, and I was like, man, we gotta do something on Carthage.
All one has to do is examine the sources which influence the understanding of those individuals who claim that Joseph fought polygamy and that Brigham Young conspired to kill Joseph Smith in order to understand their antagonism. They have knowingly or indirectly been encouraged by RLDS members Richard and Pamela Price and their book, Joseph Fought Polygamy, and the old 1990s debunked YouTube video, The Carthage Conspiracy. More recently, a man who is no longer a member of the church named Ronald Karen wrote a book in 2018 titled The Exoneration of Emma, Joseph, and Hiram, which he dedicated to his RLDS aunt, whom he claims, quote, inspired my work. Karen reveals in the preface of his work that one of his purposes is to, quote, offer proof that Emma, Joseph, and Hiram did not participate or practice polygamy in any way, but instead fought it vigorously, close quote. He also revealed that he was aided by the research of Richard and Pamela Price. On August 17th, 2021, when Karen's work was called into question based on the testimonies of the plural wives of the prophet Joseph Smith and other solid historical evidences, Ronald Karen threatened in a social media comment when he said, quote, our moronic forefathers and mothers were and are disgusting. May these lying whores be endlessly raped in their respective hells by their demonic priesthood leaders until all truth is revealed or until the end of time, whichever occurs last. Let them take their pain and complaints to Brigham and Heber. Close quote. We need to ask ourselves, are these the words of a professional historian who wrote a book based on sound historical data? Or are these the words of a man who produced a work in order to slander God's people and to instill doubt and confusion in the minds of believers? More importantly, is this the kind of person that any rational human being would allow to influence his or her understanding of the spiritual truths of the restoration? Karen's work and the work of Richard and Pamela Price also influenced the work of Whitney Horning, a former Latter-day Saint who is now part of Denver Snuffer's Remnant movement. Whitney Horning published her book in 2019 based on the same premise as both the Prices and Ronald Karen. Satan has set up a kingdom whose doctrines include all manner of lies concerning the Lord's people and his church. If the adversary can convince us to believe those lies, he gains a temporary victory. This should not come as a surprise. We should expect false spirits to advance any notion they can to deceive, and we should expect that the devil to find and use susceptible advocates on earth who promote his attacks against God's chosen servants. Brigham Young was ordained under the hand of the prophet Joseph Smith, and in Nauvoo, after the death of Joseph Smith, the doctrine of plural marriage was used as a weapon to attack the ordained leadership of Brigham Young in order to dismantle the keys and priesthood and to destroy the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Those who fought against Brigham Young were traitors of the prophet Joseph Smith and were full of corruption, and their names today are virtually unknown except in the context of observing their evil fruits. The New Testament said that every man's work will be tried by fire. 1 Corinthians 3:13. Every man's work shall be made manifest, for the day shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire, and the fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. History has already vindicated Brigham Young. Consider, why did God honor the work and sacrifice of Brigham Young and the saints, while their avowed enemies failed in their attempts to stop them from completing the temple and becoming a mighty people in the Rocky Mountains, as prophesied by the prophet Joseph Smith? Why did God not honor the RLDS Church and other breakoff movements which fought against Brigham Young? Today, these are they who have resurrected the RLDS crusade and are again using polygamy as a theological weapon to fight against the ordained leadership of Brigham Young in order to attack the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. These modern-day key players have replaced RLDS members Richard and Pamela Price in the Joseph Fott polygamy movement and are combining with a former member of the church named Justin Griffin to help him in his attempt to frame Brigham Young, John Taylor, and Willard Richards for the cold-blooded murder of the prophet Joseph Smith. And they are now looking for converts to their movements to help perpetuate their false narrative. When the enemy of all truth and righteousness is thwarted in his efforts to destroy the work of God, he infuses lies into the breasts of others and sends out floods of falsehood to overwhelm his victims, that the destruction which he could not bring to pass himself might be brought to pass by another. Consider the implications. If their narrative is true, then the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints would be built on murder and adultery and would not have the power of the Lord's priesthood. If true, then the ordinances of every man and woman in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints since 1844 are null and void, and we would have no chance to work out our salvation and exaltation in this life. But these men and women fight in vain. Why? Because God has declared that no unhallowed hand can stop the work from progressing. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints does hold the keys and the priesthood for the salvation of the children of men, both for the dead and the living, as well as the keys for the gathering of Israel through active missionary work and temple building. The one truthful thing Rob Farthingham said in his video is, quote, "Every member must decide," close quote. Our testimonies are being tried. Our loyalty to God and his work are being tested. And how many of us have testimonies that will stand the fire? I know where I stand. Brigham Young was the man called, above all other men, to carry on the work of the prophet Joseph Smith. When the scroll shall be unfolded listing life's labors of Brigham Young, he will be recognized as one of the world's greatest benefactors. As a leader, the world will search in vain for one who surpasses him in righteous achievement and valor. In history's greatest trek across an uncharted desert, he was indeed a prophet who prophesied, a seer who saw, and a revelator who revealed. He was, like all great men, one whom the righteous loved and whom the wicked hated. This is my testimony. Thanks for listening.